don't talk. All right. So like we talked about last time, our purpose of this is to try to get as realistic, photorealistic as we can within the confines of this assignment, okay? So in some instances, we would push this out and have like a 12-hour render, so it's super ultra photorealistic and the textures are all, but we're just going to minimize that, okay? So looking at those original images, remember we had that backdrop, okay? That was just like a really nice looking rounded plane like this that allows us to create some really nice soft curves in the background and not have a hard edge. Now in some instances you may want an edge to go across. In some instances you may want to. In some it's going to be very distracting. It's going to be very like, there's a step here that I keep missing. It's very obvious that there's a line and it looks horrible. So in this case I don't want that, so I'm just going to keep this nice soft rounding here. Now the way I did that was I made a plane and I extruded one edge and I just hit 3 and it smooths it out. I could also make a cube, delete everything but the 2 faces and hit 3 and that would create the exact same look. Okay? Yes, sir.
One of the problems I'm seeing is if you model in 3, does everything have to be modeled in 3 or
no.
Only what's selected?
Only what's selected. Okay? If I click this, hit 1, it just goes back. Right? Hit 3, then it's going to smooth it out. Okay?
I'm doing something.
Because it's not showing it up when you render?
I haven't rendered anything yet.
Okay.
It's turning everything into 3 basically. It's jacking up my model.
If you marquee everything and hit 3, it will.
Okay.
Or if it's grouped and you hit 3, it'll definitely do that. Okay? So on an individual basis, I can hit 3 and then it'll smooth that one object out. Now, on these computers at the college, they haven't updated Mental Ray yet. So if you were to try to render through Mental Ray on these ones, you would get blackness and it would freak you out. So on these, you actually have to download the Mental Ray Service Pack 1. Okay, so I have my backdrop here. I'm just going to create a dummy object just so I have something here to light. It all depends on your own workflow of how you want to do your lighting and texturing, which order you want to do those things in. In some cases, it makes sense to do your lighting first, because when you do your lighting, you're only focusing on what the lighting looks like. You're not focusing on what the textures look like with the lighting. So you can really just focus on the one element, okay? So I have this object here. I'm just going to add some lights. Now, one of the things that you should get not in the habit of doing is under the lights in 2016, you'll notice that there's a couple extra options now. It used to be just this top area. Now there's a Mental Ray section and there's other lights down here, okay? Avoid using these lights down there. And here's the reason for it. If I make a physical area light, oops. Inside the area light, I get a bunch of other stuff that's connected to this area light. It's not just an area light. It's an area light with all this other stuff that's connected. So if I want to duplicate it, none of that stuff comes with it. Okay? Also, some of the other stuff that we're going to be getting into doesn't use that stuff very nicely. So get in the habit of just using a regular area light for your stuff. Now, I'm going to go back to the lights for a second after I just kind of pull this out. Now in the intro class, we may have played around with different kinds of lights, or in one of the other classes. In Mental Ray, it's unacceptable to use an ambient light, okay? An ambient light was something that was created to fake lighting. We're not faking any lighting here. We want our lights to look as realistic as possible. So if we wanted a little bit of softer light or a little bit of background light, we're going to add a light that's for the background. Directional light is okay to use, but this is really for environmental lighting. If I have a scene and I need everything to be kind of lit a certain way, I can use a directional light. Typically something like the sun, I would use that for. Point lights are great for just points, just adding like these kinds of lights here, or we don't have any other ones in here, like a torch light. If we had that, those would be great for point lights too. Spotlights are good for spotlights. So like the projector is basically a spotlight. It's shining the light out of the projector and hitting the screen and illuminating it. But the best kind of light is the area light, okay? The area light gives us the most realistic look to it because it has a starting point and it has a volume and it goes out, okay? The other one that we would use is typically a point light. So for most jobs, I'll use either a point light for lights like this guy here, or an area light for pretty much everything else, okay? Especially when I'm doing a light for a product, I definitely want to do stuff like that. I'm going to jump to product photography. And probably have to turn on lights first. Okay, so if we look at this, this is a common setup here. So we have, in this case, we have 3 lights. We have 2, those little black ball things, 2 coming from the side and 1 coming from above. Okay, that's a typical lighting scenario. With an area light, that's what I can use to set it up. If I choose a spotlight, I can't do that kind of light with it. A spotlight is not that kind of light. A point light isn't that kind of light. Okay? But an area light is the closest thing we have to it. So with this, you can see that it's square. So I'm going to go into my options here and change some things. So the first thing I want to do is we always want to change our decay to quadratic. Our light source starts at point A, and without anything else on, it'll go forever at that same intensity rate. And we all know that light doesn't do that. This light bulb here can't be seen from outer space because eventually that intensity just dies off, right? So the rate at which it decays is quadratic. In the real world, that's how it decays, okay? The formula, whatever. Linear and cubic are there just for fun in case you needed specific reasons for those. Every single time you're going to pick quadratic, okay? Unless there's a really, for instance, where you needed something like that. Now, because we took the decay rate and changed it to quadratic, that means that the intensity, which is at 1 right now, is way too low. So basically, we took something that was super bright, and we shrunk it down to this tiny area. Okay, so we're not going to be able to see anything. And when I say that this is too low, it may have to go up to like 1,000. It may have to go up to 5,000 or 10,000. All of that is going to depend on your scene. If my scene is super tiny, that number doesn't have to be 10,000. If my scene is super big, 10,000 may not be enough, okay? So I start off at 1,000. We can go anywhere after that, okay? We'll all play with it and see. The next area I jump down to is mental ray. And in mental ray, I want to tell mental ray to use the light shape, okay? The light shape is basically that square. I'm telling mental ray, I want you to use this square as how big my light source is. If my light source is, this big, I scale that square down. If it's enormous, I scale that square up. And mental ray will read that as a different size. Bigger lights produce more light. Smaller lights produce less light, right? Makes sense. Right here is where I can choose the shape. Right now it's rectangle. Now I have a disc, okay? So even though there's a square around it, the circle inside is telling me that this is a disc light. So if I were to hit the render button, I'm probably not going to see the light because I don't have that option turned on. I'm not. I'm going to hit visible here just so I can see the light for a second. Come on. Oh, am I not in mental ray? I'm in Maya software, thank you. That's why I can't see it. There we go. Okay, so now we have this circle. That's our light. And it is pretty grainy, and it is pretty dark. So my 1,000 that I've set is probably too low still. Now that doesn't mean I'm going to go up to 1,002. That means I'm going to go up to 2,000 or 4,000 or 6,000. You make huge jumps until you get closer to that range, and then you start whittling yourself into that exact area you need to be in.
Where does the graininess come from?
The graininess is going to come from our render settings, okay? Right now, we don't care about the grain. We can control the grain at any point. All we're concerned about now is just the coloration of how much lighting we're getting. Because if I take the grain away, it's going to take longer to render, right? So we don't care about the grain so much at this moment. Now, one area I can change that is right here, high samples. So I do typically just leave that down. So on my light, I take my high samples and lower it to 1. And just for fun, let's see if that corrects any of the graininess. Nope, it's the exact same graininess. It actually took 2 seconds less to render. Okay, so there's that. So again, I can play with the shape of this. I can play with the shape intensity if I want to see the shape. I typically don't need to see the shape. And then I can play with this intensity here. So I'm going to go up to 5,000. I'm going to pull it up. I'm going to pull it back. Oops. I'm going to aim it right at it. So I hit T, and T allows me to move what this is aiming at. Okay. Now also, because I'm intensifying my light, some of that grain may go away. Some of it may be more apparent. It may be more contrasted of how it is. Now without, I don't like that black in the corner. Let me just rotate that slightly. Now with just my one light in there, that doesn't look too bad. That looks very artsy. It looks very like prominent of what that is. So for some things, one light may be good enough, okay? Now it's actually, just so you're aware, it's grainier on here than it is on my screen. So there might be a little bit more contrast coming out of there. So I'm going to take this light and I'm going to duplicate it and scoot it over. And I don't like them both to be at the same intensity, so I'm going to make one of them a bit brighter than the other, okay? If you have all of your lights at the same intensity, then what happens is it washes everything out, okay? Because I have 10 units coming from here and 10 units coming from there, and they just balance each other perfectly, so I don't get any contrast, any differences. Okay, so I'm just going to render this again. And what we should have is that one side's a bit brighter, the other side's a bit darker, and that's what we have. Now we have to look at this from a composition standpoint. You want to look at your stuff and not just, yep, it's lit, let's go on to the next step, okay? We want to look at it and see, does it stand out, okay? Is there a definite discerning from the background to that foreground element? And if there's not, we need to keep working on that, okay? So just as an example, let's say I take this light and I make it 5,000. And then I'm just going to duplicate the light. I'm going to put it above it. Something like that. And I'll render it again. And as I'm doing this, all these lights are the same intensity. So I may start to like wash this thing out where my object is now blending in too close with the background. And there's not really this big 3D-ness to my object. Okay, look at that. See how dark the background is and how light my object is? And now look at that. Okay? Do you see how this color here in the center is pretty close to that color right there? It's not horrible right now, but it's not really as good as it could be. Okay? If you've taken photo class, one of the things they teach in photo class is what's called the rim light. The rim light is this little light that goes along the side of the object. And if we look at a product, and there we go. Look at this object here. You see that little light coming into the side here. That could be a rim light or it could be a fill light. Go. You can see how it kind of pops off the background, even though this one's actually like a little bit too washed out. There, that's better. So this one here, there's definite discerning from the background to the foreground. These things really pop onto the screen. And they need to because of the color that they are. If those blended in too much with the background, we'd really lose the entire illusion of that. Okay, look at this one. This nice little light here that just kind of offsets it from the background. It looks pretty nice. For some movies, they'll even have like, you know, it's not like they're just dropping in a couple lights. They'll have hundreds of lights for some scenes in some digital movies. There you go. Look at these lights. It wanted it dark right in the middle. So what they did, they have no light or very little light going in the middle. And then on the sides, they just have two tall lights. Okay. Now, like we said before, let me delete this one. These light sizes matter. So if I take these and stretch them out, I'm going to get a different look than I would otherwise. Okay. Now I am getting more grain with this one. The shadows are definitely a bit longer than they were before. And it's still kind of like washed out a bit. Okay. There's my good one. I like that one better. And this one's just kind of like blah. Everything is just kind of like muddy and murky and locked into that same area. So again, let me go back and make my intensity on this one maybe 10,000. Maybe this one will be 3,000 or 4,000. For none of my stuff are you going to be able to copy values. Okay, you can use them as starting points, but your stuff is going to be so much different than mine. Okay, if you scaled yours up huge, it's going to be different. If you scaled it down tiny, it's going to be different. Let's close that and pull it back again. So I'm going up to 20,000 on one of these because I really want to accent that side. I really want one side to be a lot more intense than the other side, like that. Okay. Now, if I want another light, I could add another light behind it. But for now, I'm kind of happy with the way the lighting is working. Okay. Now, just so you can see what it looks like with the soft background, that's what it looks like. See how there's no seam right there? It's perfectly smooth going up. So now I'm going to grab my background, hit 1. I'm going to save this. Click the save button. Click the render button. And now this is going to give it a different look. This is something that I typically don't like. Because we have that hard edge going straight across it, it just kind of looks junky. Okay? So you can see in this case, we have that hard edge. It definitely looked better when I had it nice and smooth like this. No stuff happening right there. Okay? Now, if we were doing something like edge shaving cream, maybe that would make sense, you know, because we have an edge going through it. Or we had something that was supposed to be more rigid, that would make more sense. So I'm going to keep it nice and smooth. Now I do have to keep in mind that this is kind of cutting off right here, so I have to adjust it and all that stuff. But for now, I'm just going to leave it. Okay. So there's my lighting. Works out good. I have 2 lights in this case. One is at 20,000, one is at 4,000, and it just kind of balances them. I could adjust these further. I can give these coloring. But I don't like to color things at this point because when I add my texture to it, I want to see what the texture looks like with it and then come back. Yes, sir. Say it again. Say it louder.
Why did you take away the third light?
Oh, the third light? Because it was just washing it out too much. Okay. In this case, I could have taken a third light, not really put it on top like that, but I could have added it like this. And just kind of had it light up the back of this thing. Okay, so now I have this like shine coming straight down here. Now this also introduces another element, which is I have a front shadow, which you typically wouldn't want a front shadow in these. Okay, and also this is like blinding, okay, because now we have that 20,000 intensity light hitting that side. But this is where Maya gets into being better than just real photography, because we can tell it that we, let's see, we don't want it to emit shadows. So we can turn shadows off, okay? I could also turn off What was the other thing I was going to turn off? Oh, I can click this light, shift click the background here, and under lighting and shading, I can break my light links. So what that means is that that light is not going to light up the ground. So it's only going to be lighting up my surface.
No kidding.
So there's my front shadow is gone, right? No front shadow. The washed out white is gone. And so now all I'm left with is this nice little highlight that I can really move that light around anywhere and create a nice little rim to help pop that model a little bit more forward. Okay? So it's very cool that we can do that. Now in this case, there we go. In these cases here, these aren't just regular lights. These are like lights with diffusers on them. So the light hits this white sheet of paper, this white plastic, and it just fans it out and softens the light all over the place. So that's, for this case, what they're really using that light for. There aren't any harsh lights. In Maya, we're pretty much using harder lights to hit stuff, okay? So we just have to be a little bit more delicate with how we're doing it. That light is still a bit intense. So I'm going to grab that light again and just knock this down to maybe like 8,000. Okay, your goal in setting up your lighting is to not rush through it, but to do it quick enough that you get a good enough setup. Okay, and in some cases you can actually go through and create a default setup, a default photo studio, and just drop models into it and texture those models. Okay, so if you had, let's say today you're doing a spray paint ad, you have the setup for the lights, you drop your spray paint cans in there, you scale them up, there it is, all the lighting's already done, right? And then next week you're doing a car. Well, maybe you have a different setup for a car, but similar thing, let's drop it in there and light it, and it's already set up. Okay, so people who do lighting, they don't rebuild their stuff every single time. They have templates that they just kind of jump to and use those as starting points. Okay, so that's how your lighting is going to work. You just go through one light at a time and try to figure out what you want the lighting to look like. If it gets too overwhelming, then turn off some of your lights. So this light here, that is really my fill light, this is at 4,000. If I wanted to see what my fill light's doing, I need to turn off my other lights. So this is my key light, and this is my rim light. So what I can do is grab these two lights, put them on a layer, hide the layer, and now when I go and render this, I should get just the fill light. And then I can see what's the fill light contributing to the scene. In some cases, you might render and see that it's contributing nothing to the scene. And then it's like, well, why am I even using it? But in this case, you can see what it's doing. It's filling in all of this extra data here. And I say, okay, well, what's the other lights doing? So I turn that light back on. Maybe I'll just delete the layer because it's just a temporary layer. And I'll say, what's this rim light doing? Put those on a layer, render it out. All right, that's what the rim light's doing. And then I can do the same thing with the key light to see what the key light's doing. And I could play with all of these until I get, exactly what I want. All right. So that's the lighting part. Just take it one step at a time, make sure one light is set up good, and then you can start to duplicate that and move it around as needed. For the next part, for your texturing part, what we have to do is we have to take this and we're going to be adding a label or some sort of mechanism to that, okay? So what we want to do is, let's say I have something in Illustrator. Well, I like Photoshop. I'm just going to jump to Photoshop. So what we want to do is we want to create a label. So if we go to something like this, there we go. So here's a Coke label. So this label is essentially what it looks like. Let's just jump back to that. This label is what it looks like if you were to take a can of Coke or something and you cut the top off, you cut the bottom off, you split it, and then you just flatten it out. That's what this label is, okay? So this pop can that I have here, cut the top off, cut the bottom off, and then right here is where the label is. You just cut that and you just flatten it. That's the label, okay? So this is something that's been designed inside of Illustrator, InDesign. It could have been in Photoshop too. Typically for all this kind of text work, you usually use Illustrator or InDesign and then save it out as a TIFF. I prefer Photoshop just because I'm better at Photoshop. So for this case, let's just pretend that I have a label. I'm not even going to like worry about any of the other stuff there. I'm just going to go with my brush. And I want you to consider, like, I wouldn't make a Pepsi can. Make up your own names, okay? If you want to do the same kind of color and the same kind of theme, that's fine, but I don't want you to mimic that exactly. I want you to make up your own stuff. So I'm just going to try to write an S. That's a P, and there you go, SPAP, there we go. So I'm just going to save this into my library. Come on.
Are you using a tablet?
Nope, I'm using my fingers. And it doesn't want to go to my desktop. All right, it's not showing it, but we'll just pretend it's there, okay? Pepsi, I'm sorry, SPAP, TIFF. Beautiful, okay? So now if I took my SPAP thing and I just dropped it in here, any materials we use, we're going with Mental Ray, okay? That's going to be our end rendering engine that we use. So we want to avoid at all costs, let me just skip back to that. We want to avoid any of these favorites here, the blends, the Lamberts, the layered shaders, all this stuff here. The one that we're going to be using is going to be the Mia shader. So under Mental Ray, there it is. Under Mental Ray, Mia Material X Passes, okay? So for this assignment, we're using the Mia Material X Passes. There's another one we'll use at another time, but for now, that's what we're using. So in this one, we have our color here, and that's the color of the can. That's where our label is going to go. So on the color, I'm going to drop in my file. And I threw this on the desktop, and I did that just to show you don't want to just throw your stuff wherever, okay? Remember in the first class, you made a project, you set your project, you organized your stuff. You want to do that with all the stuff that we're doing, okay? It'll just make your life a lot easier. Okay, so I realized, hey, I didn't put it in the right spot, so I'm going to go and make a project. Project window, new project, 2520, SPAP. There we go. And then on my desktop, I'm going to grab that. I have to close it from Photoshop. And in my source images, I'm going to drop that TIFF image. Okay, so now when I go in here and I go to my folder, it takes me right to source images. There's the SPAP. And then I hit 6 and I realize, hey, that's not how I wanted it to go. In my mind, I know what I want to happen, but obviously Maya doesn't know what I want to happen. So it just like does that. So what we need to do is we need to lay out the UVs, okay? If you don't remember what the UVs are, it's all of how Maya takes your 3D can and makes it flat so we can put textures on it, okay? So with this, I'm going to lay out the UVs. So because this shape is just a cylinder, it's actually pretty easy to do. I also want to think about how the object itself is going to be colored. If this is a pop can, okay, the top of this is most likely going to be an aluminum coloring, right? The bottom is going to be this aluminum coloring, and this is going to be where my label is. So I'm kind of like sectioning things off as to where different textures are going to be. So for this, I'm going to go to my insert edge loop, and just put in a division there and put in a division down here. Okay. Now I didn't model anything with this one. You definitely want to model your stuff before you go to this stage. So I'm going to grab the face for this. Okay, so I've just grabbed that face going all the way around. Let me close some of these things. And I'm going to go to UV, and I'm going to say cylindrical mapping. Okay, and what cylindrical mapping is going to do is it's going to take my object and it's going to be able to wrap a texture around it cylindrically. Because it's a cylinder shape, cylindrical mapping should work. All right, so I get, it might be hard to see, but I get this like half cylinder. So I'm going to grab the red and just pull it over. And so now that's showing how that texture is wrapping around that cylinder shape. So now if I were to hit 6, you can see how now I can at least read SPEP, okay? Even though it's kind of cut off right there. Under Window UV Texture Editor, I'm going to dim my image, but I can see how this texture is now laid out. My S, probably from Photoshop, was cut off, and I just didn't pay attention to it in there. The orange box that's highlighted around it, that's the area that's getting that texture. So in here, I can go to my UVs, grab the UVs, and start to manipulate them to get this lined up with where I need that to be. Okay. Now, just a couple points to keep in mind is that I typically don't want to go outside this top right quadrant. So you see how there's like 4 areas here? Okay. This top right quadrant is my texture. I want to keep all my UVs pretty much in that area. I don't want to move them outside of that, because once I do, watch what's going to happen. See how I'm getting like extra SPEPs in there? Because I've gone outside that box, it's basically repeating that texture all over the place.
At what point does your literal texture, not your UVs, go in the other quadrant?
My texture? Never.
Okay.
Okay, your texture stays within that square. Now, when we get into doing something like a character, we will move the UVs out of that box, but we're also going to offset our texture so it's also out of the box. Okay, but typically it stays within that top right box. Okay, so there's my texture. Now, I don't know if I'm getting any stretching or squashing or whatever from Photoshop into Maya. Okay, just an example of that. Let's say I went back to my texture here. D drive there.
Can you shrink your texture?
I can, but let's say that I don't want to just shrink it. I want to make sure this is legit. So I'm going to go to a circle. This is a perfect circle inside of Photoshop, and there it is. Okay, so I'm just saving it. I come back into Maya. I find my Mia, and I'm just reloading. Okay, so now here, there's my perfect circle.
It was on top too.
Right. It was on top too. I don't care about that because that'll be a different material. Okay. But this part here, this is not a perfect circle. So what's happening going from Photoshop into Maya? It's squashing, right? It's squeezing it in. Now I could go into the UV texture and I can adjust this. So that looks a little bit more uniform, right? So that looks actually pretty close to it. A little bit more right there. And it's hard to see, right? Because this circle goes all the way around. So let me jump back into Photoshop. Let me make that circle smaller. I'll actually make a couple circles. Oops. Okay, and I'll jump back into Maya. I'll reload my texture. And so now I can kind of look at these individual circles and say, there, that circle is perfectly round. The projector's squishing it a little bit. But it's perfectly round on my screen. It's perfectly round over here and over here. So all of these circles are perfectly round. My UVs over there need to stay exactly that format. Okay, if I move them outside of that format, if I stretch it like this, it's going to stretch my texture. Okay? Now what's also happening here is this is square. Right? That top quadrant is square. My texture that I didn't pay any attention to inside of Photoshop is rectangle. So I'm going to have an issue kind of mentally getting my stuff to look correct when I'm dealing with this square inside of Maya or rectangle inside of Photoshop. So it's easier to keep everything square as we do it. Okay? So here's the correct way to line up all this stuff. So I'm going to go into my color here, and instead of having it to be a file, I'm going to put a checkerboard on it. Okay, and the checkerboard is showing me that my squares up there are not squares here, right? So if my picture is square, then this should be square. So I'm going to go to my UVs. I'm going to grab all the UVs, and I'm going to manipulate it until they're square. So that looks like it's pretty square. These squares here look like they're all evenly sized. There's not one that's stretched out or whatever, squished or anything. Okay. I could also go into my checkerboard and make more repeats and make it a little bit more obvious. And it looks good. Okay. So now let me turn my image off so we don't see it. And there we go. That's even easier to see. So now you can see what my UVs look like here. Now the reason that we kind of went away from the first idea and are going with this idea is that this idea gives us consistency. If I use this square checkerboard pattern and I lay out my UVs for any object, any square texture I bring in is going to line up perfectly with my object. Okay? If I had one texture that was like this, landscape, I had another texture that was portrait, those two are not going to be placed or look the same on the same object if their stuff is laid out different. Okay? So I lay it out like this. And then what I can do is I go to object mode and I grab a UV snapshot. Okay, so polygons, UV snapshot. And I give this a size. And you'll see that these size numbers are going to be locked. Okay, now this is going to be an important step. Our output resolution for these is going to be something that we can print and put up like as an actual magazine ad or something. All right. So I want this size to be huge, 4096 by 4096. Typically, when in doubt, go with a bigger size. Go with something that's 4096 by 4096 because you can always downsize it if it's going really slow or you end up not needing it. Okay? For a still image, it works great, 4096 by 4096. If you had every texture in your entire scene that big, and you're rendering out an animation, it's going to go super slow. Okay? So it's always best to kind of start there and then work your way down. If you had a remote control, you can see all the text that's on here. I need that text to show up if it's really close to the camera. Okay? So I need a higher resolution image. If this is all the way in the background on the floor upside down, I don't need that much resolution. Okay? Yes, sir.
So by taking a snapshot, you're in essence saving the texture as is, telling the computer or Maya that the next time you come to this, it's going to be 496, and that's what you're looking for.
What this snapshot is doing is you see this image over here of where my object is. It's taking a snapshot of that so I can bring it into Photoshop and paint right on top of it. So I know where the top is, I know where the bottom is, I know where all my lines are. Okay? So here's my out UV, that's what it's going to call it. It's going to put it inside images. So now I go back to here. I go into my images folder. And there it is. Okay? Now it looks like it's blank, but looks can be deceiving. So on here is my UVs. So I'm going to double click here and just do a stroke right there. Okay? So I did a stroke on top of this, and as I pull the size up, there it goes, and change it to outside, I can actually see those UVs. Now, because this was 4096, that we couldn't see it because it was like a pixel thick, so it's just too thin. So just make it thicker. Okay, so now I can just make a new layer, and I'll get my text tool out, and I can type SPAP. A choice of a new generation. And where is my text? Character. There we go. And from now, at this point, it's simply just a matter of customizing this how I want my label to look. Okay? So I know you have to keep in mind that this is a label, right? So this is my pop can that I've cut the top off, cut the bottom off, cut the side, and flattened out. I'm only seeing this portion of my label. So most of my effort should be in this area, less effort here, and the least amount of effort on the back. Okay? If you decided at some point you wanted to do like a 360 turntable, then equal effort all the way around. Okay? I recommend not using any lorem ipsum fake text stuff. Look at some stuff, make up text that kind of makes sense, because it looks much more professional than just using blah text. Okay? Like I said, I don't want you using Pepsi or whatever it is. Make up your own brand so you can stick your stuff on top of that, sir.
You want us to take that in InDesign and become the lettering?
You can take it in InDesign if you want to do your lettering. I like Photoshop, so I do all my stuff in here. But that's me, okay? You can take this into InDesign, design it up, but I would still bring it back into Photoshop before you save it out, just to make sure that in here it's lined up where you need it to be lined up, okay? So looking at this, I'm going to assume that the word the and the word new are too close to the outside and are going to be cut off a bit, okay? I think it's stretching out too far around there. So I'm just going to drop in another new layer below this, color it white, and save this to browse folders. There we go. My source images. And I'm saving this as a TIFF. Oops. I'm saving this as an if. Ifs or TIFFs. Never save your stuff as JPEGs because you lose quality that way. So now I'm just going to map that file right onto that. Okay, so there it is. It's on the wrong side, so I'm just going to rotate this. And just like I predicted, you can see that the word the and the word new are just too far out to the sides. It's hard to see those two words. It's workable, you know, like maybe I can make it work, but it's so easy just to jump into Photoshop and do something like that. Even if that's horrible, you can obviously do something better, but for now that'll work. Don't tell Ron I did that. Oops. Okay, and then I'm just going to reload my file. There we go. So now we're able to read each line of that text, okay? Now again, once I know where my boundaries are, once I know that I can't go too far past this N or too far past that N with what my front of the can is going to look like, then I can just go gangbusters and just spend an hour or 2 hours designing what this label is going to look like, taking it to make it look like something like this. So here's the front of that label is right here, right? Right about there. And then the rest of it, there's the side of the label, here's the back of the label, and then you can just make it look really, really cool. And then we save it, And then we can start to customize the rest of the can and what the rest of the can looks like. The top of the can, like I said, and the bottom of the can would be just that aluminum. So I'll assign me a material. I go over here to the presets if you haven't played with these, and I go to satin metal and replace. Now I have satin metal up there. And for the rest of my can, label. I can just start to play with my reflections, play with my glossiness. And then eventually I'll look at this and see what it's going to look like once I've colored it and all that other stuff, to see what it's going to look like with my lighting. Because my color from Photoshop was white, the can's going to look super washed out. Okay? So obviously I wouldn't want the can to be super white because it just washes it out. So I'll go in here. Oops, come on. I'll go to my color overlay. I'll make it like that. Perfect. Oops. And then I'll reload my stuff here. There we go. Yes, sir.
When you look at like a magazine, people use the same program in Maya as when you use computer.
Well, it doesn't matter what program they're using. They might be using 3D Studio Max or Maya or something else, but essentially it's the same process. So if you understand the process in Maya, you can apply it to Modo or 3ds Max or Lightwave or any other application. Yeah, it's really vintage. Okay, so that's the steps that you should be taking after you're done with the modeling. Do your lighting and get your lighting all set up. Then do your texturing and get your texturing all set up. Now, for this case, I didn't do any UV layout on the top of the can because it's just a plain metal. Okay, there's no texture being applied to it. There's no texture being applied to the bottom of the can. It's just metal. The texturing happened all around that area that was right here. If I had an entire plane or sphere or anything, torus, and this entire thing was just a metal color, except for these faces right here, where I wanted to put my SPEP logo. Okay, so here's where I want to put my SPEP logo. Then I would just go to the UVs and I would just do my planar mapping for this one. I did cylindrical around my can because it's cylindrical mapping. I did planar mapping here because this is pretty much a planar surface. Okay, and then I can adjust this to get it lined up with how I need that texture to be. Okay, now if you have a special circumstance, try to figure it out first. Go to YouTube, go to Google, look at these things because every case is going to be different. All right. If you have something where it's just this area, grab the faces, apply the texture, planar map it or whatever, and then you're good to go. You just adjust it. Okay. Like I said, over break, I'll get you the video and actually rendering this stuff out and kind of finalizing it and then putting it all together. All right. All right, so I'm going to go to my label here, and way on the bottom there's an advanced tab. And here we can do what's called additional coloring. Okay, so if I go into this and I add additional coloring, and then I render it out, we'll see that it's going to look like it's kind of glowing because it's going to be whiter, because it's basically just adding white on top of that. Yes, it is. With that other material, it sure is taking forever. Okay, so it's going to make it kind of look like it's going to glow. The problem with glows inside of Maya is that they suck. Okay.
Yeah, it killed the color.
Right, it killed the color. We lost our detail. All the other stuff that we wanted is just gone. So what we would do is, and this will be more in the other lecture. Hey, where's my render settings? Here they are. So what we would do is we would do what's called a render pass. There they are. And on a render pass, I would say no. A render pass is different because this is going to be a light.
Oh, you're gonna overlay it. You're gonna need two passes.
Yes. Indirect. I'm looking for incandescence. Incandescence, anyone? They moved where all the stuff is at.
Won't that be in quality?
No. Depth, normal, ocean, UV, position, ambient. Oh, direct light pass. I don't know. I'll find it and put that in the other one. But yes, we would do a different pass. I don't know why it's not there. But a different pass, and what it would do is it would render out our flattened image just like we were looking at before. But then we would have another image that we could lay on top of it that we can color it however we want. We can make that glow. We can adjust it in post, like in After Effects. And if we wanted it to like his laptop screen, we wanted it to flicker, we wanted to change the image, we wanted to do whatever to it, we can do all that stuff in post after we get out of Maya.
What are you looking for again?
Incandescence. I thought I saw it, but it wasn't there. It might be just emission. They may have even just changed the name of it. I don't think they did, but we'll see. Let me just grab this, go there. File, layer, emission. Nope, it's not it. Okay, I'll figure out what it is, and I'll make sure that's in the next one. Okay, but that's how we would do that. So you just texture it just like normal. Oops. And then we'll render that out after the fact. Okay. All right. So I'll save this lecture